and do want to remind everyone that we are live on Facebook. So just keep that in mind at the Wellness and Recovery's Facebook page. My name is Malaya Florendo, and I'm the trainer with RX Safe Del Norte, and I want to welcome you all for being here today and hope you're all having a great morning. Today we'll be going over our wonderful workshop, the Historical Trauma and Historical Resilience, Healing and Wellness through Community Resurgence and Community-Based Interventions from our wonderful presenter, Cutcha Risling Baldy. Cutcha, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be joining you all today. I am coming to you from Wiyot Lands in McKinleyville, California, very far northern California. And I am the department chair and recent associate professor. I got tenure and promotion this year in Native American Studies at Humboldt State University. I work a lot with adolescents and youth development, especially in regards to the impacts of culture on adolescents and youth development. And then I do a lot, as much as I can, working with community on cultural revitalization, especially around arts and culture. I think that's become a little bit more difficult lately with everything that's happening, but I love that we have been able to make a lot of connections across communities now via Zoom, via online presentations, and thinking about what we're going to do and how we're going to sort of not just move through this time, but move into a lot of really special Indigenous futures. And I look forward to talking to you today a little bit about my work, my book, and then also some of the things that I have helped communities discuss when they think about how they want to address larger issues within their communities, especially from like a very community-based space. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we're so happy to have you here today. And yeah, I hope everyone's excited. I do want to, before we get started again, just remind everyone that we are live on Facebook, and please remember you're muted and your video is turned off. So if you do have any questions, you are welcome to leave them in the chat or raise your hand. You can also leave them in the chat on our Facebook Live, and we'll have someone monitoring so we can get to your questions as soon as possible. We do want to remind everyone watching on Facebook Live that it is about a 45-second delay, so it may take us a second to get to your questions, so just hold in and we'll have someone monitoring. We also want to go over a few group agreements before we get started today. We just want to remind everyone that respect and kindness are key. If you're not being respectful and it becomes a persistent issue, we will have to remove you from the group today. Please show tolerance and sensitivity for differences. Participants in the group may come from different cultural, racial, gender, and sexually oriented backgrounds, and we want to be aware and sensitive to judgmental comments. Please use positive language and stay away from any negative language. This is a safe space and it is free of judgment, so it's all right to disagree with someone else's point of views, but however, we don't want to put each other down for it. And this is a space where participants should feel comfortable to be themselves, share their thoughts and any ideas without any worry of punishment or judgment. If you are sharing stories today, any personal information, just remember to try and leave out names of stories or say, I know someone who, because using names often aids in the spread of rumors and detracts from the point of the information trying to be communicated. So we just want to keep in mind respect and privacy. Remember to ask clarification for anything that you don't understand. So don't be afraid to ask us any questions if you don't understand the information provided. Remember, you can leave questions in the chat. So thank you, everyone. We do want to mind the group agreements today in the presentation, as always. We also want to recognize that some of the conversations coming up today may bring up some feelings or concerns, and we just want you to reach out if you need to anybody, because sometimes these talks around trauma and resilience even can be very heavy conversations for us today. So if you do need to reach out, you can call the mental health line. For Down Norte, we have the number here, as well as the 24-hour crisis services. We have the number below as well. Call 911 if you need to. And we do want to remind everyone's informed consent and privacy that each person's participation in this presentation is voluntary. So please respect the privacy of others and do not share personal information with anyone else. This training is being recorded and may be live on social media. If you are participating via Zoom, please turn your video camera off and stay muted. And we also want to, of course, acknowledge the land that we are meeting across virtually for many Indigenous peoples. Where I'm from right now, Talowa Duni, the Yurok, the Karuk, the Hupa, Wiyot, and many rancherias such as Elk Valley, the Rezagini, Big Lagoon, Trinidad, Blue Lake, Table Bluff, and Brunerville. The Indigenous peoples who lived together and cared for this land and each other since time immemorial. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have been the stewards of this land for generations. We know the effects of colonization have impacted Indigenous people disproportionately, and we hope that through this series we can learn together to help heal and work towards a healthy future. So again, just remember to always acknowledge the land that you are meeting on today. And yeah, just again, thank you for being here today. We will have an evaluation at the end of the presentation. So we will show that again at the end, but we don't want to remind you that there will be an eval at the end that's pretty general, and just answer it to the best of your ability. Any evaluation form that's filled out today equals 1 entry into the wellness raffle that we'll be having during this series. We'll have a couple different prizes, wellness prizes, some feel-good stuff, books, coffee mugs, that kind of stuff. So definitely make sure to turn in your evaluation for us today and you'll get an entry into the raffle. So thank you everyone for listening to our intro today, and I do want to give the floor to Cutcha.
Oh my gosh, I always have to remember to unmute now, right? It's like our new lifestyle. Thank you everyone for joining us today. It's always really nice to see people who want to join into these conversations virtually or however we can, so that we can connect and learn more from each other. I'm excited to give you the talk, but also I'm trying something a little bit new. We'll see how it works out, right? Because you always try something new and then it could fall apart. But maybe we'll have fun with it. I was talking to my brother yesterday, and I was telling him that I was going to do this talk, and he said, well, could you do something else besides just sort of talking at everybody? Is there any way to get people kind of involved? And he really, really wanted me to do a puppet show. But the thought of like putting that all together in such a short period of time, I was like, I can't put a puppet show together. But we kind of talked about it more. In the future, we'll be doing puppet shows, watch, like me and him, to kind of teach people. But we talked about it more and more, and I was like, well, what I could probably do, because you're right, like we kind of get on here and we talk a lot and then we wait till the very end for questions, is that I could try to do some polls throughout the presentation to see how the audience is doing with what we're doing on the screen and what's happening. And so I will say this, if you're on a computer, you should be able to participate in the poll. And if you have your cell phone, you should also be able to participate in the poll. And when I pull it up, I'll talk to you a little bit about how we can figure that out. It involves like texting to the polling people, and then they will put it up on the screen. It's a whole program. But also there'll be a way for you to log in on the computer to be able to answer the polls. And then once we get it the first time, the other times it should hopefully be easier. And the thing I will say about it is I try to use these in classes also, and they tend to work as well as they can. And I understand that people are in different situations in terms of internet and connectivity. So don't feel like if you can't participate in the poll, something's going to happen. It's sort of a way for us to kind of see what's going on with each other. I'm going to start here. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to do a little bit with a presentation, and then I'm going to try to flip over to the poll. So it's going to be a little bit of back and forth, just things for people to keep in mind. So let me share my screen with you. All right. Someday I'm gonna get it together and have to clean up my desktop so I don't have to like feel embarrassed when I log into these things, and then you guys get to see what's happening on my desktop. Today we are gonna talk a little bit about historical trauma and historical resilience. I will say a couple of things for you. One is that I am going to go through things very quickly, and I know that people might want to write down absolutely everything that they're seeing. I always encourage people, like I will share my slides and give them to the people who are organizing the conference so that they can share them, because I would much prefer if people in situations where they're coming to listen to a talk actually can try to take a moment to really listen to the story that's being told, instead of focusing a lot less on how do I get the information down in my notebook or on my notes, but more how can I listen to what's happening and kind of embrace this discussion and how we're going to build a discussion together and really kind of let it sink in what I'm thinking about. That doesn't mean you can't write anything down. Like I will write very like scattered notes about things that really stick with me. But I always say to people, don't try to get down every single bullet point. Don't try to get down every single piece of information, because you can have it later. I don't give it to people ahead of time just because I want them to sort of pay attention to the way that the story is being put together. So don't worry yourself about like, can I get the slides? Yes, I will find some way for you to get the slides. But also I'd like you to kind of think about this as me trying to tell you a story about what I think about when I think about how we understand historical trauma and historical resilience, and then what I do and how I've put together ways that we can start to think about how we work in community and what we do when we work with community in order to address historical trauma and refocus on historical resilience and resurgence. So I'm going to talk about that today, and I'm encouraging people because there is a lot of information, and I don't know if people are brand new being introduced to this, or if they have taken some of these kinds of workshops before, or if they've taken Native American Studies classes before and they're sort of really already there. I'm kind of going through a lot of information very quickly. I will also say some of the information might be very surprising or shocking, especially if you've never taken a workshop like this before, or it might be information that you've never heard. And I always tell people sometimes in that moment, we can get very stuck in, oh no, and now I'm really kind of taken aback by what I've just heard about this history and this trauma. And I will want to sort of focus only on that. And I don't want you to walk away today with a sense of sort of sadness or being overwhelmed by what has happened in Native communities, what continues to happen with colonization, because I think what we are trying to get people to understand and to move toward is that we have this history that is very silenced and very left out of how we learn about our cultures and how we learn about sort of U.S. history in general. But what it should do is give a sense to everyone that they have a responsibility toward movement and action, and that there are things that we can do as community-based workers, as people doing this work on the ground with people, to actually implement real changes and allow people to feel empowered by their experiences and cultures. And that's where I want people to sort of focus. So I'm going to do a quick introduction to myself. Again, I'm Dr. Cutcha Risling Baldy. I'm Hoopa, Yurok, and Karuk, and I am enrolled in the Hoopa Valley Tribe. When I introduce myself to people, I often say I'm Kinyatyan, because that is Hoopa's way of saying, like, I'm a human being, I'm a person. But what it actually means is that I am an acorn eater, because we in Hoopa said that to be a person, to be a whole person, you had to eat acorns, and that people throughout California eat acorns. And what we notice about them is that while our acorns may be different, that we are all acorn eaters, and that's what makes us human. That's what makes us some people. And to see those connections across cultures and to sort of talk about Kunyatyan in a way that says, when we're looking at this space, we're really looking at how we all share this space. And acorns all share this space in the different ways that they exist here in what is currently called the state of California. it's been important for me to kind of think about Kinyayan as foundational to how I understand what we need to do in our communities. And part of that is because I have been doing more and more work on the reconnection of our communities with indigenous foods. And part of that is as I was kind of starting to learn stories about acorns and the importance of them to us, I was really listening to elders reflect on the fact that throughout the history of colonization and this and them sort of coming here to this region, there was a real attack on our acorns and this focus on trying to get rid of our connection to acorns. And part of that was because that's what connected us to our lands. And that's what connected us to our histories. And that's what, you know, told us that we were people, human beings, that we were Indian people. And I am really struck by the fact that you see incidences in history where they are deliberately trying to not just eradicate us as people, but they are trying to eradicate our acorns. They're making plans to possibly cut, like clear cut oak trees. They're asking questions about what it would mean to completely get rid of all oak trees that produce acorns that Native people use for food. They're outlawing Native people actually using acorns for food. And so to think about that disconnection, the way that we disconnect from this very basic food for us, something that not only connects us to land, but keeps us healthy, and then to think about where we're at today with that disconnection. And the reason why I want to bring that up is because one of the things that we have started to do in the programs that I'm a part of is to center this moment of how we can help our youth to reconnect to acorns. And this is something that at first I thought of as very small. I was like, okay, what one thing that we should all do, and we were talking about it with our programs, is we should find some way to incorporate acorns into our meal, because it used to be that we would eat a lot of acorns, and now our youth don't really eat acorns and they don't really feel that same connection to acorns, and it's really important to build that over time. And I wanted to give a sense to our youth that acorns were sort of very normalized, that they were something that they should think about in their everyday lives because they are acorn eaters, they're acorn people, they're Indian people, and they're connected through their food. And when we thought about it for the programs that I work with, we were looking at how can we make it sort of an everyday aspect of what they do. And I noticed that at first the youth that we worked with were a little bit hesitant to eat the acorns because, again, we live now in a world where we are used to food tasting very sweet or very sour or very salty, that they add lots of things to the food to make it taste more so that you have a certain reaction to it when you eat it. And so our processed foods have kind of become what we think food tastes like. And then when we taste other foods, especially our youth, they're like, well, this doesn't taste right, or this doesn't taste good. And so they don't have this same connection. And we were trying to think, how can we do this in a way that sort of says, no, this is really important, but also this is a part of who we are on a daily basis. So for the programs that we do, and right now I'm primarily working with an organization called Two Feathers Native American Family Services. And if you haven't heard about Two Feathers, you should look them up. They're doing amazing things online with like speaker series, but they're also working on programming for youth specifically and how to kind of connect them during this period of time and after. But what we did was we decided that before every lunch meal, our youth would eat acorns. And they would do it, it was always very small, like a very small cup, a very like a taste of acorns. And it would be a way to kind of help them to feel invited to reconnect to being acorn eaters, because that's a foundation of who we are as Native people. And at first I noticed we had to do a lot of explaining. Like we were saying, you know, you need to understand the process that it took to get these acorns to you, that it's basically a year or more long process between gathering, drying, cracking, sorting, cleaning, grinding, sifting, like all the way to bringing these acorns to you. There were people who were doing all of that work just to make you have this moment where you could do this. So we don't want to be disrespectful of that. We want to be open to these acorns. And then we also taught them about saying prayers to the acorns. We would have people come and tell them stories about acorns and why they were so important. And we did it in a way that said, when we taste the acorns, and again, they were also often very small tastes, that we were not going to make a face, or we weren't going to say that they didn't taste good. We were going to approach them in a really good way so that we could start to invite ourselves into reconnecting with these acorns. And at first, some of the youth were very hesitant to do that. I think some of them were kind of like afraid that they weren't going to be able to kind of eat them and not like sort of dislike them. There were some who just were like, I don't like these, right? But the more that we did it and the more we encouraged them and helped them, they have now come to expect acorns as part of the programs that we do. So when they come for lunch, they're like, where's the acorns? And we have to do the acorns and we have to talk about the acorns. And they really reflect in the surveys that we're doing with them about how important it is to think about the acorns, and that sometimes it's the first time that they've ever tasted acorns before. And other times they talk about how now they are getting used to acorns, and then they understand like that they make them feel strong, or they make them feel like they're really connecting. So I think it's like, it started out as something where I was thinking this is a small thing that we can do, but that small thing became such an important part of what I understood about how we reconnect and how we build from resurgence a reconnection to our communities. And instead of thinking about just talking to them about the trauma that led to their disconnection, so thinking like, well, you have a trauma that happened and this is why we don't eat acorns. We wanted to talk to them about why it was so important to build this resurgence for them, and that was what was going to empower them to move into the future. That was what was going to build them as Indian people, as acorn eaters, across cultures, across spaces, so that they could connect in really meaningful ways. And I think that it's an amazing way of kind of demonstrating that sometimes when we think about what an intervention can look like, or what a community-based practice can look like, we might think big only. And this was one small thing that we do at every single time we serve a lunch, that now the youth have come to really think about in a much larger way about their connection to what it means to be acorn eaters. So I'm joining you today from Lands in McKinleyville, California. And because I wanted to get a sense of where people are at, I created a poll. And so I'm going to do this. What this is it's called Poll Everywhere. It's a website where we can actually see people putting up responses while they're doing it. And all you would need to do is, if you are on a computer, you could go to pollev, so POLLEV.com, and then you would do /Cutcha Baldy 869. Or you can text Cutcha Baldy 869 to 37607. And if you text this message to 37607, that was the number you'd put in to text to, that joins this poll. And then after that, you can actually type into your text message your answer. So what I'm wondering is, if anybody has a moment and they would like to, if you could share for us on which Indigenous lands you are watching or listening from today. So where are you at? But in terms of the Indigenous lands that you are on. And I like to help people to rethink in terms of how they talk about the lands that they're on. You'll notice that we try in our own ways to recenter the Indigenous peoples of the spaces where we are, and to kind of think about how we can not center sort of the non-Indigenous names or spaces, but to center the Indigenous peoples. And that can sometimes be hard to do, but I do like to know where people are. But I also think that we need to know the Indigenous peoples of the place where we are at. And I think it helps to kind of show that we have people who are joining us from different places. I will say that right now, there is like an incredibly important resurgence that's happening throughout the country, and I would say even the world, of understanding our role and place in how we connect to people of color, like Black, Indigenous people of color. And part of that for me is really looking at who we are and where we, like the spaces in which we occupy. And I want us to remember that if we don't know like the Indigenous lands that we're watching or listening from, it is our responsibility to find out like who are the peoples where we are from. Now, the thing that I have used for this poll is it's actually a word cloud. So the more that people write the same word, the bigger that word will get. It'll help to kind of see. The only way it doesn't work is like if something's two words. If you have a two-word name, then it will register it as two different words. So it's not like a perfect program, but I see people joining us from Wiat country, Talawa country. Oh, I see Hoopa, Kuya. We've got Yurok, Tongva. That's really good. So I think we're getting a sense of where some people are from, which makes me feel really good. Um, I would highly encourage you that if you are coming here today and you are on the land of Indigenous peoples and you are wondering what you can do to support them, that aside from just knowing who they are or where you're at, you think about how you can support the movements or the things that they are doing, and think about like where they're at and how you can support some of the programs that they run, some of the nonprofits that they work with, because this is the time for action. We are right now in a time for action, in a time where we can actually act and make a real difference in how we're going to do things. So thank you everyone for sharing a little bit about where you are. Oh, there's Kumiai. I love it. I love seeing where people are and welcoming people into this space, even virtually, where I am, which is in Wiat country. Awesome. I'm gonna go back to my You can keep sharing on the poll. It's still live even while I'm over here in my presentation. So today we're gonna talk about decolonizing community interventions and community-based practices. We're gonna look a little bit at ceremony and reconnection through culturally based programming, and then talk about the impact on health and wellness practices where we center reconnection, resurgence, and re-indigenization. And I'm really in particular focused on women's coming of age ceremonies in my own work, but am also in working with Two Feathers. We're looking at the impact of like our stick game in this area, which is kind of like a hockey, kind of lacrosse type game. And so I think that we're looking at how we can find connections across different types of cultural activities here. But I hope that in your own areas, you're able to see also how we can apply what I'm going to talk about today to sort of larger things that you're doing in your communities. The book that I wrote, if you're wondering, and that kind of goes into this a lot more, if you want to know a little bit more about women's ceremony specifically, but also why this type of resurgence and revitalization is so important and what's the impact that it can have on community and what happens when we start talking about resurgence and revitalization and resilience. So this is the book, We Are Dancing for You, Native Feminisms and the Revitalization of Women's Coming of Age Ceremonies. It has been out since 2019. I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of the young women that worked with me to make this book happen and who I interviewed and the people that they're becoming and the work that they've done on and the people that the work they're doing in communities. The book basically goes through what is the history of what happened to women's ceremonies in California specifically, and sort of what happened with gender violence. It talks about the work that we had to do to revitalize the ceremony, and then it interviews the young women who have done the ceremony within the first 10 years to talk a little bit about what was the impact that it had on their lives and what are the things that they think people should know about why these types of community-based practices and interventions are so important. I think a lot about listening to a panel that Two Feathers did a few weeks ago, and if you want to see it, it should be up on their YouTube channel soon, where we talked with people who have been working on the revitalization of coming of age ceremonies in our region. These are several different peoples from different tribes. And one of the things that really struck me was listening to my own mother talk, where she said that what she wants people to realize is these moments that we are in right now, where people are looking for solutions of how we move forward, what anti-racist work really looks like, what interventions really look like that are going to help communities rather than rely on interventions that will criminalize us or try to police us. And she said those things are not going to come from another place, that actually it's our cultures, it's our epistemologies, it's our ceremonial beliefs, it's who we are that is supposed to build what we're doing right now. And she was like, we have the answers, we have the methods, we have what we need. We need to use to believe it, and then we need to reconnect to those things and make those things happen. That the solutions to what is happening right now are not going to come from the colonizing culture, they're going to come from us. And so I really think about that when I think about why we center the interventions that we do, because I think we've had a lot of other people try to tell us what should happen in our communities, and really the true answers and methods that should happen have already been taught to us, and we need to believe in them, and we need to say this is what's going to work for our people and our youth and our future generations. So when we focus like on history and historical trauma, I think this is really important right now. Right now, the situation that we are looking at is what happens when people start to see the important role that history plays in shaping contemporary ideas about what policy looks like, what laws are supposed to look like, and then who we are supposed to be in this right now space. And I think that when we're talking about what's going on all over the country, we're looking at what happened because the history that has been taught to people has left out the trauma, the violence, the sort of the killing, all the things that had to happen to make this moment that we are in right now. And we are Native people, Black, Indigenous, people of color are left out of that narrative. We are pushed to the side and told that we are sort of like either victims, or we weren't that important, or that our histories aren't the real history. And then now what we're seeing is what happens when we realize that the history that we've been taught is a white supremacist history, and that white supremacist history has been made to kind of make sure that we are not empowered as a community so that we can do things to reconnect to land, to reclaim our rights, to look at how we're going to build indigenized futures. And so part of what we need to do is understand history in a way that is critiquing this idea that somehow it didn't take violence to get here. And we need to like take that narrative back. And I always tell people when we're talking about historical trauma, we're talking about how people understand and learn our history, and then how we understand and learn our own history. And we need to recenter ourselves in our own stories of what we want people to know and how we got to this point. So I use this chart a lot in my classes, but I'm going to show you. One of the things that I am particularly interested in is the ways in which we internalize this historical narrative, because we start learning it from being very young, right? Like all of school is set up to teach us a particular narrative of history, and that narrative is often designed to disempower Indigenous peoples. And so as a young Indigenous person going through school, you don't usually get to hear empowering narratives of your cultures and your peoples. And yet we hear very empowering narratives about the American Revolution, about the founding fathers, about like what we were doing in the Civil War. It's all like these great stories about the kind of ways that we built this country, yet we don't get to hear about the empowering narratives of what was happening with like Black, Indigenous people of color. And even if we do, it's very short. It's not sort of like centered in the history. It's kind of an aside. And what's important for me is that we understand that throughout history, we have been at the center of what has been happening. Like history is about how are they going to get at the land? How are they going to be the people that have like rightful ownership of this space? They are really dealing with Indigenous peoples. They couldn't have built the country that we have. I mean, it's all based on the dispossession of land of Indigenous peoples, the removal and killing of Indigenous and genocide of Indigenous peoples, and then the labor, the enslavement, and the mistreatment of Black peoples, the sort of like oppression of peoples of color. So that is what is foundational to this history. We have to understand that in a way that then says this is why we are at this position, and to get out of that, we need to empower ourselves in history and in the present. So when we look at what we understand as our historical timeline, we often start at 1492, which if you know, 1492 is Columbus, right? 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And that's where we kind of start history. We will usually refer to things before that as prehistoric, pre-contact, or pre-Columbian. You can kind of see that as like everything before that is like pre-Columbus. And then they call that also prehistoric. I always say to people, do you know what else is prehistoric? Dinosaurs. So really, like everything before Columbus is just dinosaurs to people. And everything after that becomes history. And you start to tell these eras of history as if that's the moment when the stories of the land were created, when we had sort of like, um, you have Jeannie O'Brien calling it firsting and lasting. So they say it's the first school that's ever been established, it's the first town, and all those things are not true. Like all the places that they're coming to are named, have history, have stories, but they started here in 1492. In 1769 in California, they build the first mission in San Diego. In 1849, we have the gold rush, which is where massive influxes of people come into California. In 1969, we land on the moon. I always say to people, allegedly, because I watch YouTube. I know, right? But anyway, 1969, we allegedly land on the moon. And then in 2007, Kim Kardashian got her own TV show. So I feel like between 1492 and 2007, like we've done a lot. We got Twitter now, right? People are taking pictures of their food for everybody. Like we've got all these things that I don't think people could have even thought about before. And that happened in a very short period of time, relatively. And we've done so much, and we can name them, right? We've got eras of history during this period of time. Some people will come up to you and they'll be like, the only part of history I focus on is reconstruction. And that's perfectly valid because it's like, right. So we break now our history down into these very small parts. In 2015, they declared Junipero Serra, the father of the Spanish mission system, a saint. So you can see that this history of what we understand keeps coming up about how people understand our histories. And so Junipero Serra gets declared a saint even though he is the father of a mission system which worked to enslave and kill and dispossess indigenous peoples of land. And that's, I guess, sainthood, right? So you see how this keeps coming up. Now, this is like approximately 500 years in which we can talk about so much that happened, and we break it down into very finite parts. But when we're talking about anything before that, minimum in the United States, we're talking about 14,600 years of history. And that's like what they've been able to establish. They just did a recent find, this was a few years ago, where they showed that they were able to date some bones that they found. They think that there's the possibility that human beings have been near California off the coast, like near the islands, for over 100,000 years. So if this is minimum 14,000 years, and you think about what we've accomplished in like 500 years, like what we've done history-wise, there's a lot that they leave out about us. I mean, think about all the things that must have been happening, the philosophies, the ways of living, the things that we know, the knowledge that we've built. I always say to people, like, our knowledge is very old. It is based on a lot of scientific data that we collected over thousands of years. It is based on how we viewed the world through experience for thousands of years. So we are not coming to our recommendations of what we should be doing and how we should be like addressing things and what are best practices for living here on this land and what are the ways that we can actually heal these spaces. We do not come to that lightly. We come to that with thousands of years of figuring that out and really being mindful about that. And knowing that, we need to remember that then how we tell our histories and what we center does really matter. And what has been erased from us is that we are active parts of all of those histories. So we have taken these complex societies, our indigenous complex societies with very multifaceted histories, we've erased them to make them Indian nations of primitive hunter-gatherers, and we sort of come in and out of history, but we're never at the center. And I think it's important for us to recenter that for ourselves, because we're not going to be able to heal historical trauma or to move into a different direction until we can, for ourselves, center us in the stories about what history looks like and what kind of stories we need to tell. And we're seeing it right now with people being like, I don't know why Mount Rushmore is so bad. And you're kind of like, well, gee, if you know anything about history? And they're like, I do, but really the history I've learned in school books. And that history, I was reading some great things about it. Like people were saying, when we think about that history, what we need to remember is that history was designed to um, to make white people feel safe, to like sort of take out this idea that there is responsibility for that history. And so this safety for them has been prioritized. This idea that they don't need to be sort of confronted. And when people tell me like, well, I can't teach my young child about the real history because it will be bad for them, I always say, well, do you know who grows up knowing this history? Uh, like Indian kids, they grew up knowing what happened. So if we're so concerned with protecting children, who are we really protecting when we're like, we can't tell them the history? Because the Indian kids I know, they grow up knowing the history. And when I talk to my own daughter about it and I share with her the things that I teach people, I always ask her, like, does this make you feel bad? Does this make you feel like something's wrong? And she says, no, it makes me feel like Indian people are strong and that they did so many things and that they were fighting and that they tried to carry on. And I thought that's the history I want Indian youth to learn, because that empowers them to build better futures. So our current curriculum, our way of understanding history, has been made to disempower our Indigenous youth and then to make safety for and empower white youth. And then we see what happens in the difference of who's the most likely to be successful in high school or go to college, right? So we need to keep all that in mind when we talk about why we need to learn about history. Now, historical trauma, in case you don't know, historical trauma comes out of some of the work that comes from Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart and Lamira de Bruin, which says that if you look at the issues that are facing American Indians, it results from what they call historical unresolved grief syndrome, which is a result of historical trauma that was experienced during colonization. And Eduardo Duran and Bonnie Duran write about the soul wound, which is if the traumatic response to colonialism goes unaddressed, then trauma will worsen across generations. There was some idea for a while where people were saying, well, sure, maybe you have historical trauma that somebody experienced 100 years ago, but it must lessen throughout generations. The further away you get from it, the better it will get naturally. And there's this kind of idea like the further away you get from your wound, right? But what Duran and Duran are saying is like, no, like what actually happens is that the traumatic response will worsen across generations if you don't address it. And so with everything being set up for us not to talk about our history in a way that empowers us, it worsens across generations. It does not naturally get better. What historical trauma sort of looks at is this idea that when we're talking about what it looks like in communities, if you're looking at a mass trauma on a population, that comes in the form of colonialism, slavery, war, or genocide. And then where that leads to is the population showing symptoms in response to that trauma. So this is where you get violence that's enacted against each other, or you get sort of like alcoholism, drug use, or you get people disconnecting from their families and communities. And this happens because of this trauma. Now, because of that, the population will pass those responses on to the next generations and the next generations, who will then display similar symptoms, even if they didn't necessarily experience the first mass trauma. And as Duran and Duran say, that will get worse across generations until people start to actually address the initial wound and start to think about how that has informed their view of the world, and then how do we sort of come back from all of this. So when we think about trauma, we think about it affecting people multiple generations, first in response to the trauma and then following up, because what we need to understand is it gets worse across generations. Let's see. This has actually been established by a number of sort of like scientific studies and people that have been doing studies about it. You look at how now science is saying that they can show within DNA a genetic inheritance of trauma. So DNA can actually mark trauma and stress and then be passed generation to generation. So that's something that they've been able to show on epigenetic markers and how that trauma sort of builds over time. I think what's important is in this study, they were looking for how do we understand trauma? How do we understand trauma passing through generations? And so they're saying you can look at it epigenetically and see there's marks on DNA that you can see are passed on through generations. Now, what that brought up, I think, for a few people in our communities that do this work is, well, okay, if we're looking for trauma being passed on generation to generation, which is true, well, doesn't that mean that our resilience might be passed on generation to generation? Isn't there something about also just saying, not that we're a traumatized people, but that we are also a resilient people? We are a people who have many things that we pass on, carry on, and that we had incredible moments of resilience throughout history, that we demonstrated that that resilience was really important to who we are, and that a lot of that came from our beliefs and our ties to culture and community. And so people started asking these types of questions, I think, because in the work that we did with youth, what you start to see is when someone is constantly told you're a traumatized person, you're a traumatized person, you kind of like inherently, you take that into yourself, and you start to think that you only come from a space of trauma. And I think people wanted to push back and say there's something else too, because we're not just a people of trauma, we're a people of great resilience. We're a people who were able to do many things throughout this period of time to just try and carry things forward. And we are a people now that is utilizing that resilience to build an Indigenous resurgence. And how do we help young people and people doing this work to internalize that narrative about us? So if you look at, there's an article by Lucia Cloud Ramirez and Philip Hammock that talks about narratives of resilience, and says what we did not want to just look at the trauma and the historical trauma narratives that come out of understanding history. We wanted to talk about the narratives of resilience that come out in the midst of historical trauma. And they were saying people find meaning and purpose in the context of historical oppression, and we need to give people those narratives too, so that it empowers them toward understanding that they come from great resilience and not just come from trauma. I also think about it in terms of, this is actually a terminology that comes from Gerald Visner, where he was looking at, when I want to talk about history, I don't want to just center the traumatic experiences of Indigenous peoples. I want to center the experiences that they have that talks about their survival and their resistance. And he was really looking at how in history people want to tell a story about Indian people where they are victims and that they are being traumatized. And he was like, but we are also making incredible like moments of survival and resistance to prevent us from being only defined by our trauma. And if we only tell a history where we talk about our victimhood, then we are not doing justice to the work that Indigenous peoples did throughout this history to not be passive victims, but to say, how are we going to move forward from this? And so he calls that survivance, because he was like, it's not just survival, it's not just resistance, it's both of them squished together, it's survivance. And so he wants people to remember that when you're talking about Indigenous peoples in history, you need to center not their victimhood, the tragedy and the trauma, but you need to center how they are dynamic and inventive and enduring. Like that's what's going on. And you need to remember to tell those stories, because that's what's going to move us forward in the future, to think about our dynamic, inventive, enduring peoples and our historical trauma and resilience coming in a moment out of that then we push forward into what a future could look like. So I center like words of resilience, survivance, decolonization, like the things that I think empower people throughout this history. So when I talk about like why I do this work, I primarily again focus on youth and adolescents in a lot of the work that I do. And I want to give you an example very quickly of like what we're up against today when we work with youth and adolescents in Native communities, so that you can kind of see how this compounds what is a historical trauma. I'm going to first tell you about our youth today, and then I'm going to go back and tell you about some of the things that happened to make this moment exist. Like we can't understand any of these statistics by themselves. All of these statistics are tied to history and something that happened in history to make this the case for our youth today. And I want people to keep that in mind. Like statistics today are not divorced of history, which is why learning about this history is so important. So During adolescence, and this is across the board, this is what's been established, a girl's self-esteem will plummet while a boy's will stay relatively the same or even increase. This is universal across the United States. Girls who are going through adolescence, their self-esteem plummets. And this is an important moment because adolescence is such an important moment for young people. Suicide is the second leading cause of death and 2.5 times the national rate for Native youth ages 15 to 24. So we have one of the highest rates of suicide. That's also an important thing to recognize. Again, not divorced of why, like we're going to talk a little bit about why. Native Americans have higher rates of suicide than any ethnicity and higher than the general population. Native Americans are the most likely to be killed by the police, nearly 15 times higher than whites and nearly twice as high as African Americans. This is per capita. And this statistic actually changes a lot depending on the year, but you're seeing that there is a lot of violence committed by the police against Native peoples. Native American children represent 8.4% of children in foster care, but are less than 2% of the population in the United States. Violence accounts for 75% of deaths for Native youth ages 12 to 20. High school dropout rates for Native youth are double the national average. 22% of females and 12% of females have reported to have attempted suicide, and this is for Native youth. And then the suicide rate has increased 139% for Indigenous women between 1999 and 2017. And so the story that I'm going to tell you here is I want you to look at it from start to finish. When a girl turns around 12 years old, her self-esteem plummets. That's because of the society that we live in and the way that we make girls feel about adolescence and puberty, and the way that we start to approach girls at this period of time. So around 12, her self-esteem plummets, while the boys will stay the same or increase. On top of that, then Native girls are up against this increase in suicidal ideation, in drug and alcohol use. What they've shown through statistics that they've looked at for Native youth in California is that the onset of drug and alcohol abuse tends to be like 11, 12, and 13, and that tends to be girls. And so there's something about this period of time where their self-esteem plummets, and then suddenly they start to look at how do I address this self-esteem issue? And then what you see is high school dropout rates going up, attempts at suicide are much higher for girls, and then you also see that our suicide rate has increased 139% over the last 20 years. And I think that this is very clear to me that what happens in adolescence is shaping the experience of our Native youth, and that that's the moment where they start to just be like, I don't know what to do here. And then everything starts to compound on them. So there is the historical trauma that our young people are facing, the things that they're like being put up against in this culture and society right now is affecting them so much that they have such a high rate of all of these things. And so one of the things that we need to do is look at how is this being compounded, and then how do we address this? Now, when we're talking about adolescence, and I love that in all the studies they say adolescence, what they're really talking about is the onset of menstruation and puberty. But they don't really talk about menstruation in these studies. They don't go like, well, this is about girls starting their periods, but it really is about periods. A lot of it comes down to the ways in which girls internalize that at this period of time, something is wrong with them, and that our culture is teaching them that there's something wrong with menstruation, and that somehow at puberty, girls learn this idea that their self-esteem should go down. So whatever we're doing right now is not working for young people, and yet we continue to do it. Like, we continue to teach them in this way that doesn't empower them in their adolescence. I always say to people, imagine, like, remember what you learned about puberty when you were in school. It was likely all the bad things that were going to happen. Like, you're going to grow hair everywhere, you're going to smell, right? Like, you're going to break out on your like face. Like, it was always like, here's all the bad stuff that happens in puberty. All right, go enjoy puberty, right? But there's never these sort of really empowering moments about what it means that now you're moving into adolescence. We do this all over our culture and society, especially around menstruation. And so there's these studies which show that women who thought that people knew they were menstruating actually did worse in interviews because they thought the person was judging them, and they were like, no, this person knows I'm menstruating, and so they performed less well in interviews that they were doing. They did a follow-up study which showed that people who were told that women were menstruating when they were like interviewing them said that they did think less of menstruating women. They just thought they performed less well. They just thought there was something wrong with them. So we have internalized this idea about young girls, and then we think that maybe they don't understand it or internalize it themselves, but they do, and it is causing really big effects on our communities. When they look at studies that say, well, what do we do about it? The biggest thing they say is like, all you really have to do is discuss positive experiences of puberty and menstruation with your young people. If you just give them space to talk about it with people, and you tell them positive things and they hear those kinds of stories and you empower them through that, it is enough for them to just hear it from people. And the fact that we don't do that is part of the reason why then these spiraling things happen. One of the things I talk about in the book is the history of why people focus so much on menstruation when they're talking about like sort of the negative aspects of history, but also the trauma that that brought to our communities. Because our women's coming of age ceremonies were focused on celebrating a woman's first menstruation. And so coming into our communities and saying that's wrong, and then doing really violent things to make those things stop happening, that was a trauma that was created specifically around girls, specifically around puberty, and specifically around this moment where you're looking at the importance of understanding the role of women in your culture and society. Now, Teresa Laframboise also talks about how she has specifically looked at the impact of Native American cultural practices on having indicators of how we can increase self-esteem. And she said that Native American cultural practices really are positive indicators of the issues of self-esteem, school performance, and resilient adaptation in adverse situations. And what she found is that if you have a supportive relationship with your mother, an involvement with cultural practices, and a supportive social community, then that makes you reflect support, like resilient adaptation and higher self-esteem levels. And so she was like, what we need to do are three things: build supportive relationships with your mother, and be involved with cultural practices, and have a supportive social community. And that's what's going to address these issues. She also found that for youth who had stressful home situations, maybe didn't have like a mother that they could connect with, or they felt like they were really up against some really awful things at home, she was like, they would still reflect that they were invulnerable to these stressors. They still had higher self-esteem, and they did reflect that if they had support from other adult community members. So she was saying, if you can't, like the connection that you have to other adults, the connection that other adults bring to youth, that's part of building resiliency in communities. And that connection is very important. And all of these things I see happening in our ceremonies and in our ceremonial practices. It connects us to culture. It gives us a closer relationship with our parents. It also shows a very supportive social community around you. Which brings me to the work that I do. So if you look at women's coming of age ceremonies, which we primarily do at the onset of menstruation, every tribe in North America has some kind of women's coming of age ceremony. To me, this means that we were the first developmental psychologists. We were looking at adolescence and saying, what are we gonna do here, right? Because lots of things are happening. And now that I have a teenage daughter, I can tell you a lot of things are happening all the time with her. And so how do we help her to move into this next phase of her life? How do we center her in our community? This is so important. And they really looked at, I mean, when I'm looking at these Indigenous ceremonies, they really looked at like, how do we make the kind of connections that now psychologists and scientists are telling us are important? Connections to community, connections to culture, connections to self-esteem, right? And showing that they have multiple people that they can speak with. That's all Indigenous ceremonial practices. So to me, that type of reconnection is how we're going to address this issue of the lowering of self-esteem, the onset of drug and alcohol use, and then addressing sort of like what happens because all of that happens at this moment. Western culture says puberty, something's bad, something's off, something's wrong. And our culture says puberty, we have to do something to empower them so that they can move through this period of time and become a really important part of who they're going to be in the future. And I think that that's something I really see in Indigenous ceremonies that are very important, is the way that we were looking at it, like this is why this moment is really important for us as a community, not just as an individual. Now, when you're looking at California history specifically and why it is that we have this big issue now when it comes to especially young women, but when you're looking at the impact on our youth and on our adolescents in our communities, right? Because their self-esteem is going everywhere and they've got the onset of drug and alcohol use. You're looking at, before colonization, we had about 1 million people in California. It was the largest population north of Mexico. They did a census in 1769. They were able to establish 310,000 people living in California. And by 1900, you're talking about less than 20,000. So there is a population reduction of at least 90% of the population between 1769 and 1900. And that is the big trauma, right? That's the traumatic incident that happens that then everything like keeps building from that. And when we're talking about it, people might say it's first contact, right, or colonization. But California Indian scholars often refer to this period of time as invasion. They're like, we're being invaded, and we are having to deal with the traumas that are being perpetuated against us in order to establish what becomes the state of California. Now, in particular, when you look at the way that this was affecting women, and we're talking again about like what happens in a community, right, with adolescents. So we had very different ways that we understood the role of women in indigenous cultures versus the colonizing culture. And so for us, women were doctors, leaders, regalia owners, could maintain rights to dances, participated in governmental affairs, exercise sexual autonomy, divorce, own property, approve of war, and order its end. And what they say is domestic violence at this time is very rare, and because it is not tolerated, and there was very strict punishment for this crime. Many scholars look at when they look at indigenous cultures and they go, rape doesn't exist during this time because it is so it's so not tolerated that when and if it happens, the whole community stops and says, we don't tolerate this in our community, and it becomes a community issue. Like, it is not a single person's issue, it's everybody's issue that this is happening. So you're looking at domestic violence and rape being incredibly rare during this period of time. Now, during the same time, if you're talking about colonial culture and women, they could not own property, could not choose to marry or divorce, could not inherit property, could not vote, could not participate in government affairs, had no control over their earnings. And at the time, men could legally beat their wives. And if a woman ran away from her husband, she was charged with thievery because she was stealing the clothes that he bought for her, and she could be put in jail. So you're looking at a very different way that they treat women. And these are the two cultures that then come against and clash with each other. And you also then start to see how the colonizing culture looks at what's happening in indigenous communities with women and says, we have to go after women in a very particular way. We have to take them apart because they are the ones that are holding this society together. They're holding the culture together. And if we can take the women apart, we can take the whole thing apart. So they start to do things in particular to very much target women during this history. And they target them in very specific ways. So we have to understand this as a strategy that wants to dehumanize Native women. And then what this leads to is violence. They introduce violence to Native communities and violence against Native women. Violence is very much perpetuated against Native women in very particular ways. So while you're looking at when they're coming into areas, they will often just outright kill men. They kill men, but they will then commit sexual violence against women. They will kidnap and take them. They will force them to marry. They will force them into prostitution rings. They'll force them to be enslaved. So women are being treated in a very particular way because the idea is they have to tame and control this culture, and they're going to do that through the women. This then continues because in order to continue the whole system, they have to continue putting Native women into their place. Otherwise, they're afraid that the whole thing is going to fall apart. And so they really target women because they're like, you guys are the ones having the babies. You guys are the ones that are passing on what culture is supposed to look like. And you guys also think you're supposed to be leaders, and we don't like that. So we're going to make sure we put you in your place. And that's where they're looking at, is like, how do we take apart this culture that very much believes in gender balance and very much believes that women are supposed to have equal rights with men, and the colonizing culture says we don't like that. So then this they start to erode the sovereignty of Indian people to be able to have women leaders, to be able to have women own things. They start to take apart the society that centers women. And this then erodes the ability of Native people to be able to protect women, and women become particularly at risk and targeted during this period of time, but also today. Like, it bleeds into our issues today with missing and murdered Indigenous women, because the whole system has been set up to dehumanize women so that they can make sure that they keep us under control. This begins with the mission system in California. A lot of like what we learn about, there's 21 missions established throughout the sort of southern and central part of California. When you think about this mission system, you might think about what you learned in the 4th grade and how great it was, but in reality, it's a system set up to try to like genocide and control Native people and dispossess them of land. It is not a system that is like trying to work with them. It's actually trying to enslave them first, make them convert, and then make them give up lands in the name of the church. And it also really targets women and queer people in very particular ways, because they're trying to control this culture at the same time and really push back against this culture. Junipero Serra, who we talked about earlier, who's now made a saint, he actually talks about this in his own writings. One of the first things he documents by the Spanish soldiers who are who are coming in to take the lands for the missions is that they are raping women and children in front of people, that nobody can do anything because they're being shot if they try. And he doesn't write it like he's trying to report and get everybody to do something. He's like, this is what's happening. And he doesn't try to stop it. He doesn't put the soldiers on trial. He's like, they're going around and they are raping women and children, and then they're shooting people who are trying to stop them. So the violence happens right away. It doesn't build up. It happens right away. It's the way that they establish dominance over the culture. And so they come in and do this right away. Now, that does not mean we did not push back. And this is, I think, very important for us to remember. In all the ways that we could, we established and exercised our survivance, right? And our resiliency. And one of the stories that I think, if you don't know about, that you should really look up is that of Toi Purina, who is a Tongva woman. And she, in 1785, she leads a rebellion against the mission San Gabriel. She leads 6 other villages in a rebellion against the mission. And she is a Tongva medicine woman. And they actually go to her. They're like, we want to do this movement. And they go to her to ask her, what should we do? What does this look like? Because that's the role that women are supposed to play. They're supposed to be in this role as medicine people, right? So they're practicing this very important moment, and she helps to lead them to be able to do this revolution. Now, the revolution is thwarted because of a soldier that overhears them talking about it. It's a fascinating story. I just look it up if you haven't looked at it. But what's really important is that they put her on trial, and you can actually look at some of the transcripts that she did. It's an interesting moment because it's actually being translated by somebody. So you don't know if it's exactly what she said, but what she says in her trial, one of the quotes that's attributed to her, is they ask her, like, why did you do this? Why did you try to lead this revolution? And she said, I came to inspire the dirty cowards to fight and not quail at the sight of Spanish sticks that spit fire and death, nor retch at the evil smell of gun smoke, and be done with you invaders. So you're talking about Indian people who are very clear about what's happening in this mission system, that they are being invaded and that they are going to fight back. And so I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, but that they're also trying to hold on to this idea that, like, women are part of that decision-making process. And what's really interesting about this moment is that the men who followed her into battle were also put on trial, and they were punished for trying to overthrow the mission, but they were punished again, in addition to, because they followed a woman into battle. And so the Spanish mission system is very clear about what it's trying to do in this moment and how it's trying to disempower women and what they think is important about that role. So I think we should all know about Toi Purina. If you want to know more about the mission system, because I couldn't really go into it very long, you should read Bad Indians, a tribal memoir by Deborah Miranda. Pick it up. It's a great book. It really goes into this idea about what are the effects of historical trauma on a family today. And she traces the trauma in her own family back to the mission system, but she also tells you really important stories about the ways that people were carrying on like their ceremonies, their stories, their family histories, even despite this time that's trying to erase that from all of them. So I highly recommend it if you want to look at what's the connection between the violence of the Spanish and mission system and then what's happening in our communities today. Now, the next part of what happens in California history, you're looking at the gold rush. The gold rush is a massive influx of people, 1849, where they are coming in looking for gold. They will do whatever they want to get it. They will blow up entire mountains. They are not interested in building alliances. They are here to commit violence against the land, against the people, to get the gold. And it actually, Jack Norton, who writes about this, that's the genocide in Northwest California, which I would highly recommend, talks about it as a marauding horde of people. They just rush in and they have not a care in the world. And violence in the region throughout California is introduced in a way that is what they call sort of like just without any thought. It's just whatever they can do to get at gold. It's also sanctioned by the government at the time. So the state of California actually is okay with the violence that's being perpetuated against indigenous peoples and the genocide that is happening. This is the first governor of California, 1851. He says that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. He's saying, yeah, they're all going to die, and that's just how it's going to work. It's sort of a kind of manifest destiny, weird way of talking about what's happening to people, but he basically is sanctioning it. He's not saying that they should not do it. So this becomes legalized in law and by the government, and then also the citizens are supporting this. And so when we look at how the law informs what people think they can do in history, the law at this time says it is legal to enslave, and it is legal to slave and kill Native people. That's a legal practice at this period of time. So when we are talking now in our contemporary moment about what's legal and who decides what's legal, we need to remember that throughout history, what has been made legal are things like enslavement and killing, and that we need to be very conscious of the fact that just because it's legal doesn't mean that it is moral or right. So the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians is the thing that you need to know about. It legalizes the enslavement of California Indians. It allows for the kidnapping of Native children. It encourages the killing of Native parents because orphan Native children can be taken into slavery, and it makes it so Indians cannot testify in court, so that it's only white people that can testify in court, and therefore Indian people can get put into the system and then sold into slavery. Even though California enters the Union as a no-slave state, this is what they do in order to enslave California indigenous peoples. They call them apprentices. So if you look at like the actual law, they're referring to the apprenticeship of California Indians. Again, it's for us to think about what that means, how people use this wording to justify what's happening. Now, they also established the California Volunteer Militia, which pays money for Indian scalps and heads. They are allowed to set this throughout the region of California, but you're looking at things like $5 for every severed head or 25 cents per scalp. You're talking man, women, or child, so people can turn in the scalps and heads of Indian people and get paid money. In 1851, 1852, the state of California claims that it has spent $1 million killing Indian people. So let's think about $5 or 25 cents per scalp, and they're saying it's $1 million. We need to be reimbursed $1 million for the killing of Indian people. That's the kind of level of violence that you're talking about. This is actually one of the very first acts of the California legislature when it comes into the Union, is to offer a bounty for Indian scalps. Now, one of the important things to understand about this period of time is that oftentimes people will think that the Indian people that are being taken into slavery are like older people, like people who are much older, because people might want labor. But when you actually look at the records, and so if you look specifically at the records for Humboldt County, what you find is that of the 110 people who were enslaved, a majority of them were between the ages of 7 to 12. So really, this system is enslaving children. And of those people who are ages 7 to 12, most of them are girls. So really, this is a system enslaving young Native girls to families who don't know them or care about them, taking them far away from their homes and putting them into a system at the ages between 7 and 12. And so this disrupts a lot of what we do with young girls. They're really targeting girls. And what they say is that girls get the most paid for them. Like they will get the most money for young girls. And so they're starting, they really go after young girls. And I always say to people, we have to call this system then, if we're talking about historical trauma, we have to give words to what's really happening here. And that is, that they had created a sex slave industry, that's what's going on. And that these girls are being put into situations where now they are likely being sexually assaulted and assaulted because they are not in situations where people are protecting them. So that's what's happening. It's not like an enslavement system for labor. It's not, right? They're looking at getting girls ages 7 to 12. If you want to know more about the gold rush history and kind of learn from the perspectives of Indigenous peoples, I highly recommend Northwest Indigenous Gold Rush History. It's a booklet that you can find on Humboldt's DSpace. So this is like Humboldt DSpace, calstate.edu. And it's a collection of interviews that were done by students and people at HSU. Primarily, it was led by Tag Lowry, and I think it's an important moment being able to get more insight into what was happening during the gold rush. When we talk about what that leads to today, so like we have all this trauma from this history, the way that it focused on women, the way that it focused on girls, the sort of mass killing and attempted genocide, and then we look at what we're up against today. 1 in 3 Native women will be raped in their lifetime. 39% will be subjected to domestic violence. They are 10 times more likely to be murdered than other American women, and 52% of violent crimes on reservations are not prosecuted. So we have a system that continues today where you're looking at the impacts of historical trauma, this idea of like how we understand Native women and girls, the dehumanization of them, their treatment throughout this system, and then that it's still happening today. So when we think that happened a long time ago, it's not a long time ago, it's right now. And that trauma continues right now. And part of that is because we aren't guaranteed the sovereign rights that we need to be able to prosecute non-Native offenders, to be able to prosecute people who commit crimes against our people on our lands, because we are constantly being questioned about that and having people try to take away our ability to do that. And so I think that it's really important for us to remember that we don't just talk about this in a historical context. We realize that it's ongoing today because it's part of a system that in order to exist has to continue violence against Indigenous women, and that system is perpetuated by people who continue to refuse to learn about the history, but then also look at the statistics and things today and try to explain them away when it's all tied together. So what we do then in our community is we say, look, we know this is what our girls are up against. We know this is what our young people are up against. What are we going to do? How are we going to fix this? How are we going to show that there's a way that we can address this? And in our community, one of the things that the women noticed was that we needed to bring back our women's ceremony. And part of that was because we are fortunate in our area that we have continued 2 of our ceremonies since the beginning of time. They never stopped. The deerskin dance and the jump dance. And we really were able to do that because, again, that's a story of resiliency through this historical trauma. To be able to say, no, we will not stop these ceremonies. We will continue them. And so they have continued for all time. But what you will notice about them if you watch them from a perspective of just coming to see them is that it seems that they primarily feature men in ceremonial practices, even though I think all of us would make the argument that women are very involved in each one of these ceremonies. They seem to primarily feature men. And so what happens is that people start writing about our cultures like we are male focused. And they start saying like we put men into positions of being in the forefront, right? We put men into positions of power. And then we start to internalize that in our own communities, where girls start to say like, oh, well, it's really like men who do these things, and men do this and men do that. But we don't see ourselves in the ceremonies that we're looking at going, no, we're actually really central and important to ceremony and culture. And yet part of that was because we did have this third dance that was part of this spectrum of world renewal ceremonies. And that was our women's coming of age ceremony. But we hadn't practiced it in quite a while. And that was because of this history of what I had just gone through, that it had to go underground. We couldn't do it in the same way, the same public way. And the reason being that they would target our women's ceremonies. They would come there and say that they were going to go after this girl. And they would really try to go after this ceremony for eradication. And so at a point, it became dangerous for us to do this. Because if we brought this young woman out, they were looking at that as a reason to come after her. And so we didn't stop doing it because we gave it up or because we believed there was something wrong with it. And that's what I keep trying to tell people. Like for people to say, and then they stop, like, no, we didn't stop. It was violently wrested away from us. It was taken from us through violence. And that is what we have to keep remembering and putting together. So I think that this is an important way to kind of think about what it was when they were looking at it, that they were like, how do we understand the role of women in this bigger culture? And then how do we put women at the center in a way that shows their importance to culture and ceremony? What we see then in looking at this cultural practice is that what we recenter is a positive experience of puberty, menstruation, womanhood, like this idea of who we are, the role that we play in our own cultures, the sort of people that we can become, the roles that we have played in history that we can be playing now. And you see that our languages, they speak about our menstrual experiences as really positive, and they talk about how when we're talking about the onset of menstruation and puberty, what we're talking about is luck and power, and the luck and power of women going through this experience, the luck and power that we center in our communities. And I think that that's really important for us to remember, because when we're looking at how do our practices inform this, we have to remember that our practices are based in understanding that we have luck and power, that we should be empowered people, and that we can carry this forward from learning our languages, learning our cultures. We can understand ourselves as empowered people. The same goes for then how people talk about us. And one of the things I keep pointing out is like we were only given terminology for our ceremonies that in some ways were negative, especially women's ceremonies. And so oftentimes people will talk in cultural spaces like anthropological spaces. They'll say, oh, indigenous peoples had menstrual huts, and they put women into huts and they isolated them because they thought they were dirty and something was wrong with them. And that's absolutely not true. In fact, people who have studied this in cultures all over the world have said once you do actual cultural reviews of like what's happening in this situation, people are not isolating women. They're not putting them into menstrual huts. In fact, no indigenous culture has a menstrual hut because their term for it never means menstrual hut. It means something else. Like it'll often be like women's house, other house, you know, like it'll mean something else, but the terminology gets translated to menstrual hut. And that teaches us something very specific about our cultures. So in Hoopa, we call the women's house the minch. It actually means something like a small, familiar house that is dear to you, right? And that's a very different meaning than menstrual hut. So I think we have to remember, like when we're telling these stories, we need to reclaim our languages in that. We need to use our own terminology because their terminology has been meant to degrade what we do and to sort of like pass judgment on who we are and who we are. Like we need to be the ones that decide that and that tell these stories in a way that then says to people, no, this is who we are and what we're doing and why this is important. So the flower dance ceremony, the Chihwal, it is a public celebration. It can last 3, 5, or 10 days. It's a way of building community. For the girl, she gets to see who comes out and sings and dances for her, or like helps her with things. There is a lot of training that goes into it. She'll often run. She will be doing steaming. She'll be learning about herbs. She'll do talking circles. She'll do bathing. There's all kinds of instruction. There's all kinds of people that show up to work with her. It's basically a set period of time where we're like, you are important. We are here to help you and to do with you the things that you need to feel good about your space and community, to empower you to make your own decisions, to bring you to the point where you understand that the things that you need are already with you and that you are strong enough to do that. And I think that it helps a lot for girls to see that people will stop and just focus on them and empower them and make them understand that they are so important to who we are as Hoopa people, in our culture, and in our futures. And this is everybody. This is men and women. So we call it a women's ceremony. Men and women that come. It's men and women that sing. It's men and women that help, right? And to see that type of support, I think is really important, especially for girls at this time when they're viewing this world that's trying to tell them there's something wrong with them. Now, one of the things it also does is involve multiple generations of people in this. And so the young people will chase behind the girl while she's running. They'll be in the space learning about what she's doing. I think it kind of shows them that they have something to look forward to. It shows her that like the young people are looking up to her. And in fact, what the people I interviewed told me is that within that first 10 years, what they did was really held on to the girls' ceremonies that they had gone to. And they were like, I remember going to so-and-so's, and that's what made me realize, like, I'm going to do this, and this is who I'm going to be. And then I saw the kind of person she became, and I wanted to be that person too. So it actually involves multiple generations throughout the ceremony. This is a picture of actually my mom. She's telling the kids, like, you're going to run behind this girl. This is what you have to do. This is what you have to say. And part of their job is that they're supposed to kind of tease her while they're running, so that, because she's supposed to remain in her space. She's learning how to be an adult person, how to be able to say, I'm not going to get bothered by what the kids are saying. So they're supposed to run behind her and say things. My mom always gives them the example of, like, you should say, you run like a duck, right? Or like you're teasing her to try to get her to get out of her space. And there was one little boy one time, because the girl's fasting, and he was running after her, like while she was running, trying to get her to stop and turn around. So he was like, come back to your childhood. I have a candy bar. I have a candy bar. And everybody just started laughing. So there's a lot of like joy in this ceremony, a lot of like involving people in a way that makes them feel a lot of happiness. And it shows them that like we prioritize certain things. So if you're looking at the run, right, she runs so she can be empowered in that moment and feel like she's making lots of decisions, and seeing that she has the ability to get through this run and to make those types of decisions. So I think all of these moments that we're looking at is we're building them as growth moments that she can have, and then see like and be empowered in those situations. Now you see the like large amounts of the community will show up for her, will come to say like, you know, I am grateful for the things that you are doing in this community, and I want to help you be the best that you can be. And I think that when you see that as a young person, a lot of the girls reflected to me like they didn't have to come. What I kept thinking is none of these people had to come here. None of these people had to be here, but they were here for me. And that really makes you understand that you are an important person in this world, and that the things that you're going to do are going to be important to other people. And that to me then shows a great sense of community. I interviewed Melody George Moore, who is a medicine woman for the Hoopa Valley tribe. And one of the things that she told me specifically about what she understands about the revitalization of this dance is how important it has been to addressing historical trauma. And so what she says is like, historical trauma is the continuation of unhealthy patterns of behavior. Unknowingly, we give these to our children, and I had wanted that to not happen. What I had hoped I was doing was balancing her spirit, putting on what I characterized as a suit of armor, so that in going out into the world, to know who she is as a Hoopa person, so that nobody would be able to disrupt anything. She knows who she is and can call on that strength at any given time, call on the strength that is Hoopa, the land, the people, the language, and the ancestors. And I think that several of the girls have reflected that this is how they feel. Like when they go into spaces, they have the tools they need to address some of the bigger issues that are going on in their lives, that are happening, that they feel like, I went through this and I saw step by step how I could get through it. Now I know I can do that with anything. And I think that that's a really important moment to teach people, is to start to reflect on their experiences culturally in a way that shows these are tools that build beyond this ceremony and this moment to what you can approach and understand about how you do your life, how you think about your role in community, how you think about your role in your own sort of like family, because you've experienced these things through ceremony. And I think a lot about our young people. And so these are some of my young people I work with, my nieces and my daughter. And I will tell you that like what I see in them is a great sense that this type of ceremonial practice is really important to who they are, even if they're not doing it yet. And so they start planning for their dances now when they're very young. And we went from a period of time where nobody had really seen one or done one to now like there are girls who have grown up in their lives who don't know that we never did this. I mean, in their mind, this is who we are. And so in a very short period of time, this has just become who Hoopa people are. We celebrate young women. That's what we do. We build this into our cultures and communities. And I find it very empowering that our very young people then grow up knowing this, and then they talk about it with each other. They talk about it in other spaces. They think about what they want at their own dances. They dream. And one of the things that we've been doing at Two Feathers is to start to help other young people dream about their roles in ceremony. So we've had opportunities for them to learn more about cultural materials. We've had opportunities for them to design their own dresses, to be able to look at the dresses that were made by a lot of the flower dance girls and like how they made them and what they did, to connect with people across generations, to learn how to make bark skirts. Like we're starting to find ways to bring them into this that sort of says, let's dream about the kind of like spaces that you can inhabit and what you want that to look like. And so we do this work really on a community-based level. And these were actually photos that were taken from a girls' youth empowerment camp that I did with a nonprofit I work with called the Native Women's Collective, in which we tried to design ways to reconnect girls, to give them an introduction and to invite them in to a space where they could sing, where they could learn about regalia, and where they could feel empowered by that experience. Because part of it can sometimes be that there is a sort of sense of like, what if I mess up? What if I do something wrong? And here we wanted to empower them in their experience. And so I will say this, it was a really powerful moment for me to see the ways that girls want to connect with each other in very positive ways. They want to connect with like their singing and songs. And one thing we did as part of that workshop was we actually gave a song to the girls who had come to that workshop. And we said, this is your song. And anytime you go anywhere, you can sing it and you can share it because we're giving it to you. So we taught them the song, we practiced it, we recorded it, we sent it to them so that they could practice it further. And on multiple occasions, some of these girls have showed up for us at presentations that we do, demonstrations, and have sang this song. And they will lead it by themselves. They will start it. So we did a California Indian Day presentation at Bear River, which a number of these girls are from Bear River, and a bunch of them showed up, and then they led the song for us, and we sang along with them. And they did it for the very first time in front of like a very large group of people. And so to be able to give them those moments of connection, I think have been very important. To be able to say like, this is your song, sing it, be empowered by it, share it with other people. Those are the types of things I think that have stuck with them. And then they tell us like, we want to go sing here, we want to go sing here, we want to do this. So I think, again, there's like this reconnection through being able to practice these things in safe spaces and being invited to be able to do that. So I'm going to end here because I want to leave some time for questions with a couple of like tips for, okay, if I understand this now, if I understand historical trauma, if I understand why I want to center like survivance and resilience, well, what do I need to do? And how can I participate in that in a way that really helps communities? And so I will say for people doing work in communities, we need to consider not just how we talk to them about trauma, but how we talk to them about resiliency, strength, resurgence. That we need to look at the ways in which those types of wordings and the ways that we flip our script about what we're trying to do in communities is important. So I tell people a couple of things. First is we need to remember not just to identify the traumas and what they call like the adverse childhood experiences, right, in communities and be able to say, these are all the bad things that are happening. But we also need to remember to identify the strengths of our communities and to give insight into intervention through strengths. What are the strengths that a community comes with that actually could build an intervention that will make a true difference? Not just what are the problems that a community comes with that we need to address. So some examples of strengths include extended family and kinship ties, long-term connections to land, place, and history, food, plants, animals, water, right, land, generational knowledge that continues, and then the retention and reclamation of traditional language and cultural practices. So these are some strengths that I came up with. I'm not saying they're the only ones, but the idea would be when we're thinking about interventions, when we're thinking about what do we do when we're working in communities, instead of saying, we got to address all these really awful issues, which is what I went through at first, right? Like the list of things. Instead of saying that, it's like, well, what are the strengths that we have that we can build from? And how is our program using those strengths and saying, look at what we've got. How do we make a difference in our communities? Let's focus on our long-term connection to land. Let's build that into our intervention. Let's build that into our program. Let's make that the center of what we're doing. What I say is, you know, you got to say that prevention and intervention has to include supporting the strengths of the community, community resources, as well as individual and clinical interventions. And so we can't just focus on the individual. We have to look at how is the community going to come in to this process? What does that look like? How do we then focus on prevention that then focuses also on connecting people to community? So those would be some of my tips. Now I'm going to go back to the polling really quick, because I would like you, I want to end today, let me see, I'm going to do next, with a little bit of some questions for you all, so that then maybe that will help me for some jumping off points of discussions that we can have. So I have a couple of questions that I'm going to put up. Let me see, I got to do, where's my full screen? That you can, again, you can participate the way that you had participated before, which is if you would like to text in, you can, or you can go through poll ev, right, dash Cutcha Baldy 869. And the question for me right now is, off the top of your head, what are the strengths that you can identify in the community or peoples that you work with? So based on some of the strengths that I have given you, are there any particular strengths that you can identify in the community or peoples that you work with? I mean, this really can be anything. It could be even what I had already said, but it would be nice to see if anybody has any additional ideas about some of the strengths that people can identify. So we're starting to get in some things. We've got voice, truth, speaking. I think that that's really important, right? So one of the things that we've really been talking about is like storytelling, and this idea of like how we tell a story, the fact that we can speak truth to power, that we can talk about our experiences. Those are really important things. And I think one thing that we need to remember, because sometimes I think we forget, is that young people do need to know this history and like how we tell these stories, and they need to be empowered to use their voices to be able to speak in situations about history and about their own experiences and about what happens to Indigenous peoples. I do think the more that our young people learn about our histories, the more they recognize the empowerment and the place, like the place of great power that we come from as Indigenous peoples for that. I think revitalization is also a really important strength for people. I think when you're talking about connection to place, right? Like we should always keep that in mind, like our connection to place and the ways in which we can use place in how we understand like what we address in our communities. Weavers, oh, I see weavers as one of them. I think that's really important. So like how we teach people to reconnect through using their hands and like making things. I think the things that we make in some of the programs that we do have been really important. So, and sovereignty, and that's a really great place to go. I see that somebody put down sovereignty. I completely agree. And that's the really great place to go, because I want to share with you, when people ask me sort of like, what do we do? What do we do? There's actually been a study that was done that said, when we look at what a truly empowered, valued, decolonized community actually looks like, what is that? And they wanted to say, and they looked at several communities around the world, and they said, what is it that makes it so that people actually are empowered, valued, and decolonized? And they made this list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different things that is what true decolonized, empowered, valued communities are. And so for them, this is like the list. And I would highly recommend thinking about this in terms of what your programs do or what you're doing in the work that you do. So what they say is a truly empowered, valued, and decolonized community has achieved a measure of self-governance, has litigated for Aboriginal title to traditional lands and has traditional land that they can work with, has accomplished a measure of local control over health, is self-determining over education and community policing, and creates community facilities for the preservation of culture. And these are the things that actually build empowered, valued, decolonized communities. So when you're thinking about like, what do we need to do? We need to think about how we can address these things: achieving a measure of self-governance, litigating for Aboriginal title to lands, accomplishing a measure of control over health, self-determining our education and community policing, and creating community facilities for the preservation of culture. And I want people to think about what role they play in any one of these things, and any project or program that they're planning to do, how it meets these goals, because this is sort of what needs to be centered if we're truly talking about empowering and decolonizing community work. Now, the other thing that I will say is people are always asking me like, well, how do I do this? And the first thing I will say is we have to learn to be listeners in the work that we do, because we need to listen to the communities that we're working with in order to talk about the how. I can't give you a general way that you're supposed to do this in communities. I can only say that we need to empower Indigenous communities to be the decision makers about what needs to happen, so that it actually addresses the issues that are coming up in their communities. We are our own best experts on what this could look like, and we have some of the best ideas. I will tell you that when I work with youth, I'm always saying we ask the youth what should happen, and the youth have some of the best ideas, because I feel like the youth aren't at the point yet where they're thinking about the process so much. They're just envisioning what it could be. And so sometimes the youth will say like, I think we should do this. And my response is always like, oh, well, that would take a lot of paperwork. And then I'd like have to set up a committee, and then I'd have to set up a subcommittee of that committee. And then I'd have to like write bylaws, like I start thinking about this, and the youth haven't been through all the things I've been through. So they're like, nah, just, so they dream so big. And out of there comes really important ideas about what this future is supposed to look like. So we need to involve Indigenous peoples in that decision-making process. And that comes from a couple of really important spaces of mentorship, that Indigenous scholars, knowledge holders, wisdom keepers, we need to be the ones who are the representation on boards and committees, who are hired at the organization and who are working with the institutions. Like, it really needs to be empowered Indigenous peoples leading this way. So if you have an organization with a board or a committee that's primarily leading whatever a project looks like, you need to look at who are the people on that board or committee. Are they from the groups of people that you're actually trying to work with? Who's making the decisions? Who's the ones that are like talking about what's going on? Then it's also to become really responsive and responsible to Indigenous peoples and like what they want to do. And so asking yourself, does this project support self-determination? Does it support sovereignty? Does it actually address one of the 5 things that we had gone through? If it doesn't do those things, is it the thing that we want to put our energy into? Because those are the things that actually empower Indigenous communities. And then we also need to mentor, support, and meet the educational needs of Indigenous peoples and their allies, because we want to retain and build success for Indigenous learners in all of these communities. And so part of what we should be doing in all of the things we're doing is like training people and mentoring them for how they can do this work in the future, and not to feel like it's just one group that can do it, but actually we want to empower Indigenous peoples to do this in their communities. Step 2 is to really look at your organizational capacity. And so your leadership actually needs to be dedicated to Indigenous peoples, in terms of not thinking it's like, oh, and we do that, or sure, that's a good idea, but that actually our leadership understands why we need to do this in a way that centers Indigenous peoples and how we approach their own communities. And we need to approach them as being in a learning position instead of a knowing position. So we're always saying, assume a humble posture of learning when you enter communities. And when you're looking at what it looks like to be in a community, don't come in being like, I know everything, I'm the expert, I'm the one with the training. Instead, take a position of I'm knowing and learning. I'm learning how to know about your community. I'm learning from you. I'm learning with you. and be in a position of saying, I'm always learning. And I think that helps to open up discussions with Indigenous peoples that they wouldn't have had before. The other thing to say is like training and immersion about Indigenous peoples and histories and historical trauma cannot be optional for people. When you have people saying, well, that doesn't have anything to do with what I do, I think everybody has to be invested in this in your organization. So you need to sort of say, this is mandatory. You need to learn about this. Also, you need to always be engaging Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities and leaders in the process. And that's even the day-to-day operations. So they say that if you're going to develop what they call a community of practice, it needs to be facilitated in a way that helps people to have a conversation so that they say, I'm going to be able to hear from Indigenous peoples to be engaged with them. I'm not going to like get defensive when Indigenous peoples come into spaces and share with me what's going on. I'm actually going to learn how to hear them, even if sometimes the critiques are difficult or they are very pointed, because that has to happen too. There is a healing that has to happen because of the history again. So we need to be open to stakeholders engaging in a way that they feel safe to share these experiences. And finally, there needs to be community advisory building and maintenance. So you need to ask yourself if the work you're doing is strengths-based or deficit-based, and how do you refocus it on being strengths-based. And you need to build interventions that then say, let's look at Indigenous philosophies, let's look at relationships with communities, let's look at what the communities are already doing, let's look at their strengths. Because our deficit-based approaches to things has not been helpful to empower us in how we move through these moments of trauma and resiliency. I love linking things to Indigenous languages, to words, to giving people the words for things so that they understand that this is coming from a place of a lot of really deep knowledge about who we are as Indigenous peoples. And we also need to make it a prioritized way of saying that we want to address the structural problems in our own organizations and institutions that we work for, like racism and prejudice and poverty and misogyny. Like we cannot have a group of people who are leading the way and saying, well, like we, you know, they come from a very sort of space of like white privilege, and then we go, we don't have to address our own organization because we're doing this good work over here in this community. No, we need to also look at who are the people who are working for, like at our organizations. What are the ways they talk about racism, prejudice, poverty, and misogyny? How are we addressing those issues so that if that is happening within our own organizations, if that's happening within our own tribes, we have to confront it, because we cannot do the healing and the moving forward from historical trauma if we are coming from organizations and tribes that still have racism, prejudice, poverty, and misogyny as how they base like the work that they're doing. So we need to confront all of that within our own organizations. So those are just like 3 kind of quick steps. And I will say that I appreciate everybody sort of participating in the polls today. I like the way it looks. And I wanted to kind of come back to this one really quick, just so we could see if people shared a few more. We have the revitalization, we have food, which again, and community, forgiveness. I really like that too. TEK, which again, I think is really important. That's traditional ecological knowledge and connections. Regalia, right? So looking at culture, we can see a lot of strengths in our communities, and how we can build those strengths into how we talk about our communities, talk about our interventions, talk about our programs. That's, I think, what's going to move us forward. That's what's going to help us to be able to say, like, we have all the things that we need right here at our fingertips. So let's now come together and make those things happen again. Let's reconnect. Let's build a resurgence that actually says at the center of who we are has always been that we can be like healed, balanced, and good people, and we can hold that space for our future generations. So thank you everyone for your participating in the poll today. We do have a few minutes for questions. I wanted to make sure to leave some time for questions.
Yes, we do have some questions from the Facebook Live in the chat, as well as some people directly on Zoom. I do want to recognize, thank you to those who put the links for the books or the resources that Cutcha mentioned in her presentation in the chat. So thank you for that. We do have a question from the Facebook Live, and they asked, is there just one flower dance a year for the young women?
No, there are multiple. So there are, I mean, some of them have been held as like small, like more than one girl, but most of the time it's for one girl who has put the dance together. So there can be multiple throughout usually in the summer, that's not required. It's just that most people can get work off and do things over the summer and the people are not in school in the summer. So, but yeah, there's multiple that happen throughout the year.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have a couple comments. One, thank you for including Toy Purina in your presentation. However, the quote from used was actually from a writing by Workman Temple, where he greatly elaborated on the actual trial transcripts. He also said she had green eyes. This quote is from an article written for the Southwest Museum's The Master Key from 1958, a more neutral discussion which is based on translations of the original transcripts of the trial can be read here, and they left a link.
Yeah, and I think that that's important because one of the things that I had mentioned is there are differing uh, interpretations of that moment, especially because of who's translating for her, even at the same time, because they had to have somebody translate for her even in the trial. So it is really important to think about like the multiple ways that people tell stories, and if people are doing that work, that should be something. So I hope that everybody got to see the link so that they could go and look at it. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cutcha. We really appreciate it. Do you want to give a few minutes for questions, or is there any last words you'd like to leave everyone with?
The only thing I'll say is if you're interested, there is an ongoing speaker series for the Department of Native American Studies and the Save California Salmon nonprofit. Every Friday from 12 to 1:30, we're doing Facebook Live presentations. You can also register for a certificate program in water protection and community advocacy that we're doing this summer. So it's a chance to kind of learn more about issues with what's happening with water throughout California. So people want to participate in that. There's an opportunity there. They're free. You can register if you want to complete a certificate series as part of that. And if you're wondering about the book, you can get it really anywhere, like any major bookseller. It's through the University of Washington Press. You can also get it on their website as well. So I mean, and they do have copies sometimes in Northtown Books if you're local to this region. So there's a chance to get it there too.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, maybe we can get all the information for this and share it on the Wellness and Recovery series page, if you would like that, for sure, so people can reach out, so they know how to get involved. And I just want to say thank you again, Cutcha. Amazing workshop today. It really hit home, and I just really appreciate you being here today. I think this is something that really needs to be out there, needs to be said and heard, for Indigenous people watching today, especially, remembering to empower ourselves and revitalize ourselves and remember that we are here. So I appreciate you being here today.
There are a couple more questions in the Q&A. I just don't want us to miss them.
Oh yeah, of course not.
So, one is, what is some of the ways that you decompress from this crucial work?
I think I decompress the most through laughter. I'm a big proponent of humor. I think if you're interested in reading more about like humor in Indigenous peoples, you should look at the work of Dr. Larry Gross. But I do a lot of like storytelling with my friends where we just laugh. We just try to laugh as much as possible, and having people that you can kind of decompress with, like just my grandma gave me a piece of advice when I was younger that I really internalized. I would come home and I would be like, my life is over. This is what's happened. Everything's done. I'm done. And I'd be so sad. And she would say, Cutcha, everything's a funny story later. And it gave me like a really important moment of realizing like, yeah, like eventually I probably am going to tell this story as the most hilarious thing. And I think that Indian people have a really great way of taking like some really hard subjects and making them really funny. I always say to people, like, you want to hear some of the most inappropriate jokes in your life? Go hang out with like old Indian women. Like they tell some of the dirtiest jokes, just like inappropriate to like little kids. And then they'll be like, go tell your dad that joke. Like they just, I love the sense of humor. And so I always tell people, like, we have to laugh. We have to laugh at things. And if you think about what's the funniest thing, like settler colonialism is hilarious because it's just doesn't make any sense. Like all the things that are happening. So I try to laugh as much as possible. I try to remind people that we can find joy in so many things and that we have worked that into our ceremonies and culture. Like in Hoopa, we have moments where you're supposed to tell a funny joke or moments where you're supposed to sing a funny song. I think we were always trying to say, like, you got to laugh about this. It's going to be funny, I promise. And so I remind people, I just tell funny stories, like tell jokes, make a joke out of it, you know, like take that power back from it and make it into a funny story.
I love that. That's awesome. Definitely some of the best jokes Indigenous people really have. Before we get off, we do have one more question. What classes do you recommend HSU students take this fall or spring?
You know, I think for me, if you haven't taken Introduction to Native American Studies, that's always a good class to start with. What's really interesting about this fall for the NAS department is we're going to be entirely online. So all of our courses are going to be offered online, and this is different than it has been in the past when most of our courses are in person. So if there are people who have always wanted to take an NAS class, but were like, I don't know if I could take all the time to do it, now they're going to be online, so it's an opportunity to get more people involved. I also would say our classes on like environmental justice and federal Indian law are really important. Dr. Kayla Begay is going to be teaching a language class, and what she's really, really powerful at is helping to invite people into understanding like their role in language, but also to speak it in a way that's like fun and engaging, so you don't feel like, oh, am I saying this wrong? She's really good at that, and she's teaching it online, so I think there could be some amazing opportunities there. I would always recommend people take a language class, especially if they're starting to think like, maybe I could do it, but I get a little scared. It's a chance. It's a chance to do some fun things. When I sat in on some of her classes, they were doing fun activities of like learning different language, like parts of the body, or like telling stories, sharing like aliens that they had invented, and then they had to like share different words for them that they were putting together. Anyway, I would highly recommend the language class. And then in the spring, we always teach an indigenous literature class, like things on Native American literature, and they get taught by different subjects each spring. And so I think there's really amazing opportunities there. Oh, the other thing I'll say is if you were interested in sort of like what was happening with California Indians and the genocide, this fall is the genocide class that we teach. And that's another chance to kind of look into this. And I think it's going to be a really cool class this fall. It's going to be an opportunity to kind of look at like how we talk about genocide in community in a way that could refocus instead of just on like death and destruction, in a way that says like, how do we look at empowerment? So there's a lot of classes. I always tell people, take them all. My class is already full, or I tell you to take mine, but it's got a wait list. I would hate for people to, you know, be like, oh, I'm on the wait list. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm sure a lot of students appreciate that reference. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for being here today, and we really enjoyed having you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm glad people got on.
Too. So before we get off today, I do want to remind everyone, give me 1 second. Okay, so I just want to say thank you again to everyone who joined us today. Before you get off, we do want to give you a little bit of information to get involved with the Wellness and Recovery series. You can follow our Facebook page, the Wellness and Recovery series, and as well as our RX Safe Del Norte Facebook page. You can check out our RX Safe Del Norte website at rxsafedelnorte.org for more information about our organization. We will probably have some of the resources and upcoming events that Cutcha mentioned on our Facebook page, so make sure to check that out if you want some more information on that. And remember to check out Cutcha's website at cutcharisling.baldy.com. We do want to remind everyone before we get off, please fill out the evaluation today. It really helps us out. And it's just a couple of pretty simple questions. Try and answer them the best you can. And it does give you a entry into our wellness raffle. So make sure to get those forms in. Takes a few minutes. The link is in the comments on the Facebook Live as well as on the Zoom. So make sure to check that out. If you want more updates on some upcoming workshops similar to the one we had today with Cutcha, make sure to register on our Eventbrite because you can get some updates on what's upcoming. Check out our calendar and see what we got going on for the rest of the month. So that link will also be in the comments for the Facebook Live and the Zoom. Again, I want to say thank you to Cutcha for being here today. It was an amazing presentation and we really appreciated having you. And we hope to work with you again in the future, and just walk loud. Thank you.